This is Dyer from JaysAnalysis. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. Esoteric Hollywood is where I deconstruct the biggest films in an unparalleled way, from the classics of the silver screen to today's blockbusters. Learn to watch film with new eyes as we enter Esoteric Hollywood. JaysAnalysis. If you've followed the work that I've done in the last year or so, you know that we've looked into a lot of subject matter dealing with social engineering. We've looked at Dave McGowan's works pretty in depth, and in particular, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. And if you haven't heard that, I would encourage you to read the book or go check out the interviews that he's got on YouTube or the summary and analysis that I did of the book. And the thesis there, of course, is that the 60s free love hippie generation era, this was not so much an organic movement, but rather something that might have had elements of organic anti-establishment sentiment, but that were later co-opted. And so tonight what we're going to do is look at another genre of music, something probably related, maybe tangentially, to the 60s counterculture revolution, but also perhaps just as influenced or co-opted, and that would be the subject of punk music. I'm not a huge punk music fan. I'm more so in the vein of being interested in synthwave and new wave and kind of the 80s, keyboard type stuff, Depeche Mode and so forth. But I know that from the last chapter in Dave's book, he actually hinted at the possibility of a lot of CIA involvement in that scene as well, perhaps through the character of Miles Copeland. And I was fascinated actually to hear the entire series of John Adams and Nino's covering of the punk scene, which they did over at Chris Kendall's site Hoaxbusters. So I'm honored to have both John and Nino on JaysAnalysis to do a summary and recap of their excellent full series on the history of punk and the secret motivations of the true history of punk music. How are you guys?
Good. I'm doing well.
All right, so I guess the best place to start would be, maybe you guys could give us a general outline. I'm sure a lot of listeners will be familiar with punk, but also perhaps not as familiar with the genre. So, I mean, everybody knows about classic rock and 60s counterculture. And would it be accurate to say that punk kind of comes out of another phase of this, reacting to counterculture? Like, is it a postmodern reaction to counterculture? We know it ties into anarchism. Maybe you guys could touch on that.
Okay, so when you have, at the same time that you have the hippie revolution, 1960s, hippie music kind of splinters off from what would have been relegated as just psychedelic music. And a lot of the psychedelic rock bands, they didn't have this flowery,
Thanks, man.
Peace and love type thing associated with them. They were a little bit more aggressive in their tone and in the sound of the music.
What?
And the lyrics of the music were what you would kind of classify as proto-punk. And it's interesting because by the time the punk scene starts to blossom in the 1970s, a lot of the songs that these punk bands were covering, they were just doing cover songs of this earlier wave of psychedelic rock music from the 1960s. And just to give an example to someone who doesn't know, you go look up something like You're Pushing Too Hard by the band The Seeds. And it's basically like a punk song, but it's, from 1967. It's like, you're pushing too hard, you're pushing on me, you're pushing too hard what you want me to be, you're pushing too hard with the things you say, you're pushing too hard every night and day. Just real simple and kind of just a 4-chord structure, which later on would be what punk would copy. And so you have it almost a decade earlier that's taking place, but it's taking place within the realm of psychedelic rock and revolving around stoners and that type of stuff. And a lot of it was actually taking place right out here on the Sunset Strip in Hollywood, just like the hippie stuff.
So it's more accurate to say that it's a consciously moving out of psychedelic, like those older Pink Floyd albums, you know what I mean? Like those early ones, Atom Heart, Mother, and things like this. Would that be a closer analog? Because some of those kind of had political messages, but I don't know. Does punk begin to be political, or does it later take on a political approach?
That's interesting. Well, yeah, you brought up those early Pink Floyd albums. Actually, the first Pink Floyd album is what Piper's at the Gate of Dawn,
right?
And that sound with Syd Barrett. That actually sounds a little bit more like what psychedelic music originally, was sounding like. And then as you move through, Pink Floyd's repertoire, they sound a little bit more on the hippie side.
Yeah.
There's like a line of demarcation in the sound. It's kind of hard to explain, but as far as the political aspects of it, I'd say when punk first started, and even like in the psychedelic stuff, it was a little bit political. You get like a little, songs here and there, but it mostly was very self-absorbed. And it mostly focused around kind of leisure activity, or maybe like doing what Led Zeppelin did and steal a bunch of stuff from some old blues songs.
Uh-huh.
Or it was kind of it was revolved around like taking a stand against something, but not necessarily overtly political. And punk in and of itself, like when it started in New York in the 1970s, it really was a very pretentious scene. It was an art scene. It came out of the art schools. And it was basically people who were wannabes of all of the rock stars, but they weren't cool enough to be as big as Led Zeppelin. So they kind of had this own little scene. And they were on. This is the other thing that people misunderstand about punk music is when it first started, it actually proliferated through the funding of major record labels. So it was not a do-it-yourself, somebody's pressing records in their basement type thing at all. When it first started, it was the bands who first came out, they were all on major labels. They just weren't as well known, or probably not given as much money as the bigger acts.
Mm-hmm. Well, generally, people think of the more prominent ones like Ramones or Sex Pistols or Clash. And I mean, is that the real beginning, or is there an earlier phase that sets it off, or would that be the psychedelic era that you're talking about?
Yeah, the psychedelic era, it's a bunch of one-hit wonder bands that it was interesting because one of the early proto-punk bands from the 1970s of New York is the Patti Smith group, and the guitar player for her band is a guy named Lenny Kaye, and he decided that it would be a good idea to, with the owner of Elektra Records, Jack Holzman, who's got an interesting background, by the way. They put together a compilation, like the quintessential, like proto-punk compilation, and they put it together back in the 70s. It was called Nuggets, the psychedelic era, and it has all these one-hit wonder bands and their one-hit wonder songs. But these songs, like, really did have an impact collectively, because they were played on the radio all the time. I even still remember being a little kid, and the oldies radio stations would still play some of those songs. They don't play them anymore, but they used to. And so yeah, they were still having an impact on people by a decade later, and then into the 1980s. That compilation was sought after, and still to this day people want copies of that particular compilation of music. And yes, I would say that punk definitely comes out of psychedelic rock music.
So let's get to some of the meat then, because so you've got kind of these well-known, bigger name bands that would be in the 70s, kind of the face of punk. Would you support the thesis that even back then, that early on, beyond just being on a major record label, were there already people with strange connections and maybe, a musical version of Hollywood royalty, right? That people are kind of given these contracts or deals just because of family connections. I know that, for example, you and John you and Chris did some really good talks where you mentioned, Katy Perry having like a, oil magnate uncle, Miley Cyrus has a Federal Reserve, chairman uncle, these prominent connections, right? Which may or may not have helped boost this person into the stratosphere of, quote, stardom. What's interesting about the punk idea is that it to prima facie, right, to the face of it all, it's supposed to be anti that, right? It's anti all of this, isn't it? At least so the narrative goes. But is it from the beginning, kind of already being set up, or do you think there was a period of legitimate, organic anti-establishment fervor?
I don't think that the hippie thing in and of itself was ever organic from its inception. I think it was probably manufactured from the beginning.
Right.
That's not to say that there weren't people involved with it who weren't really anti-war or anti-establishment. It's the same, and that's what I think is the same thing with punk. I think it was probably something, like I said, I think when these things are concocted, they're concocting them off of desires and what's the word I'm looking for? And attitudes that are coming as a result of certain things within society. And I people are studying this type of stuff all the time.
Right.
All of the things that blossomed out of either psychedelic music or punk rock music, it doesn't necessarily have to be every last little bit had to be like thought up in a think tank.
Yeah.
What I generally tend to think is that there are ideas about like what about how to corral people into groups when it comes to rebellion. Mm-hmm. Because rebellion is much easier to it's easier to control, but it's also easier to control if you kick it off yourself.
Yeah, right.
That's the way I look at it. So it's like if nobody's thinking about rebellion, and then you just decide, well, you know what, nobody's thinking about it right now. This is probably the best time to do it before somebody starts thinking about it. And so, like I said, that's my particular view on it. And yes, you have a lot of interesting connections with a lot of different names and faces. When it comes to punk's beginnings, and Nino definitely has a whole list. He's got his whole database full of that type of stuff. But one thing in particular, if you look at the well, you were mentioning like the Ramones and the Clash and that type of stuff. Just to give an example, the New York Dolls are considered to be like, one of like the first kind of punk bands, I guess, like where punk's kind of used. And around the same time, there's another band called Iggy and the Stooges.
Right.
And they don't really sound like what you would call punk music. They would sound kind of more like a noisy Rolling Stones. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they don't really have the punk sound as people would think of it. Like, I guess Ramones and the Clash later would kind of
trademark.
What's the word I'm looking for? Well, that's kind of what people think of when you think of punk.
Right.
And so, but the New York scene in and of itself is like full, like I was saying, it comes out of the art school scene. It doesn't have anything to do with rebellion at all.
So is it London or New York that's really, or LA that's kind of the real birthplace? What would you say?
Oh, New York.
Okay.
Yeah, it goes New York, London, and then proliferates from there outward.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's like New York scene kind of started with Velvet Underground in the '60s,
mm-hmm.
like the art scene and Andy Warhol and the Factory and all that stuff.
Yeah, I seem to remember.
And
I did listen for a while when I was younger to Lou Reed and stuff like that, and I'm wondering. It seems like I think you guys touched on that at one point in your series, and wasn't there was something bizarre about Lou Reed? I mean, obviously, Warhol had connections to the CIA's interest in his so-called art, but wasn't there something curious about Lou Reed as well?
Yeah, Lou Reed's got some bizarre stuff in his background. Nino has the whole list of it, but yeah, just for instance, is they have an album called White Light, White Heat.
Mm-hmm.
And I was always under the assumption that White Light, White Heat was a reference to heroin use.
Drugs, right.
And I think a lot of other people were under that assumption as well, that's kind of slang for heroin. Well, it turns out White Light, White Heat is actually a reference to theosophical writings.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I guess he wrote that about, Madame Blavatsky.
Wow. Let's say there you go. Like that's a juicy little tidbit there. I had no idea. And you guys probably I knew it was something but I'd forgotten, but there you go. Yeah, I never would have dreamed that Lou Reed was thinking about Madame Blavatsky, but actually when you look at it's not far-fetched because Elvis had an intense interest in Theosophy and Blavatsky. Yeah,
that's true as well. I don't think, but as far as like, don't be cruel or hound dog having some Blavatskyan undertones, I don't know about that yet.
Hound dog is an invocation to Cerberus, the dog. I'm joking.
Yeah. Hound dog's about Sirius, the dog star. Although you want to hear a funny thing about Elvis Jailhouse Rock?
Sure.
Okay, this is just for fun, but it is kind of weird. Okay, so if you go into the lyrics of Jailhouse Rock, he says that there's the line that says, "Number 47 said to number 3, you're the cutest jailbird I ever did see. I sure would be delighted with your company. Come on, do the Jailhouse Rock with me," right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the rest of the song, nobody said anything about that there were any girls involved in this Jailhouse Rock.
Well, I was going to say it's prison sex, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, okay.
So I was listening to that song one day, and I was like, I hadn't listened to it in a while, and I was just like, wait a minute.
Right.
I saw it pointed out somewhere else too after the fact.
Well, I could see that if you think about it. Blue, blue, blue Christmas, right? Blue, blow job, blue, yeah. Oral sex, obviously.
Yeah, right, blue. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, Christmas sex, but so when we hear these stories of like I remember hearing the story one time, like on a documentary or something. I don't even remember, but it was E! Or something. And it was like Johnny Rotten and the Sex Pistols came in off the street and were just handed guitars and cymbals. it was recorded and they got a contract, which sounds like a legend or something fantastical. But then again, when you think about the fact that a lot of bands are kind of just concocted creations, I could see it as plausible. Yeah. Do you think that's true, or is that a hype, or is that a legend, a selling point, or something to it?
Well, do you mean about the Sex Pistols specifically?
Yeah, the story was that they were just kind of these, droogs on the street, and then some guy was like, "Hey, they could be the image of a band." And again, I can't remember.
Yeah, it's Malcolm McLaren. Okay. And he owned a shop called Sex in Piccadilly Circus with his wife Vivian Westwood, which, by the way, I'll tell you how punk rock she is. She designs clothes for royalty. That's how punk she is. Vivian Westwood is high-end, like, haute couture,
Well, yeah. You'll see an analogous type of thing where now, with rap music or sort of the edgy rap that's out there, that, daughters of bankers and Rothschilds will date rappers. You know what I mean? That's perceived.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
Fashionistas will, mimic the hip hop style and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so anyways, the alleged story of the Sex Pistols, we'll never know the real story, but the alleged story is that they were, Malcolm McLaren picked a bunch of guys who kind of looked the part, and like I said, it's a believable story. You just have to kind of look at it the right way. Is that he picked a bunch of guys who kind of looked the part of like what he wanted to put together. He wanted to put together like some sort of band, and Nino will tell you about Malcolm McLaren. He's a situationist, and so he's into the idea of the society, the spectacle, and playing spectacle out in real life. And so that's exactly what the Sex Pistols were. It was a spectacle, and even though I don't have proof, I would definitely say that I believe it was a manufactured spectacle and probably allowed to happen, because they put out a record called, God Save the Queen, She Ain't No Human Being, there is no future, and England was dreaming. Well, this was getting radio airplay, and then it gets, subsequently banned. Of course, when it gets banned, it becomes more popular than ever. Then they get kicked off their record label, EMI. You have to wonder, like, how EMI, being the the mega corporation that they are, how they ever allowed the Sex Pistols to record it and put it out in the first place. There's the famous footage of the Sex Pistols live on primetime TV, being stoked into saying cuss words on television. And and the host is egging them on to do it.
Is there a connection? Let me ask you this, John. You mentioned spectacle. Is there a connection between performance art and punk? Like, is there a direct connect there?
Oh, absolutely.
Would this be like the G.G. Allen type guys that are like smearing feces on themselves as part of the quote act? You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I believe that there are people out there who play in punk bands who they really, really believe in what they're doing, and they think they're gonna
Yeah, right.
They're really saying, F you to the world.
Right.
But I think that when you get into these major type things, that they are aware that they're putting on a spectacle, and that the spectacle in and of itself is having some sort of ripple effect on society. And this is, when you're like me, like, 14, 15 years old, and, even earlier. I'd say I probably first heard punk music when I was like 10 or something. you don't know what the society of the spectacle is. You don't know who situationists are, so you're not thinking about that sort of thing. You're not in that mindset, and you have no idea the change just by you even having access to this type of music is having on you, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there is somebody who is aware of that,
right,
and is aware of the effect and the change that will have on society, whether it be a portion of society or whether it be as on society as a whole. And so, Sex Pistols definitely had that, and I think that's why they were allowed to exist for the short time period that they did, because it couldn't really take itself any further after like what they did.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's like what they were doing was kind of after the like it had, punk in and of itself was kind of burning itself out and like moving into like new wave and that type of stuff. So it was a overnight sensation type thing, but it had a dramatic effect on British culture. In fact, there's a famous quote from Johnny Rotten. If you go watch the documentary The Filth and the Fury, after the Sex Pistols appeared on that television show where they were just goaded into cussing and saying filthy words on TV, they changed British culture forever with that one broadcast on that television.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Comparable to like an Elvis type thing, like Elvis gyrating his hips is like this big cultural deal.
Well, you can't go back to gosh and darn after you've heard God and damn in the same sentence.
Interesting.
Right? So that's kind of how it was. And I have to say, like, the British TV, you can say pretty much anything on British TV now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, just in my lifetime, it's interesting the things you can't say, what you can and can't say has changed almost in reverse. For example, faggot. You can watch movies in the 80s where they still say faggot, right? It was a joke.
Right.
Now that is completely not PC, but you can say GD, right, on regular network television.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, you could, like, I noticed this a couple of years ago, which I thought was just hilarious. When I was still watching movies, that on the like when they have the rating, when they have the little square at the bottom of the movie, and it has the rating. It said rated R for sex, violence, and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It'll say rated R for sex, violence, and smoking.
That's funny. I was talking to a buddy of mine about that today. We were talking about smoking and the demonization of tobacco, which is, and I think maybe you and Chris touched on it on a show, and I agree with, I think, what I remember you saying. What I think this demonization of tobacco is, and we're getting a far field from punk, but we'll get back to it. I think it's kind of just a social engineering test to see what they can and can't ban. You see what I'm saying? Like,
oh yeah.
I mean, I don't think that they don't care about anyone's health, but the demonization of tobacco is, I think, intended to be merely a way to set precedent for saying what you can and can't do, say like in a public area or at a job. Like you can't have a smoke break anymore because smoking is now a civic sin. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, and I'm skeptical as to whether smoking actually gives you cancer.
Yeah, I agree.
Like the act of smoking in and of itself, like obviously I believe that the chemicals in the cigarettes give you cancer, but
not tobacco per se, right?
But not tobacco. No, I don't believe tobacco gives you cancer.
So let me ask you about.
But I don't smoke. So that's even coming from a non-smoker.
Right. So if we go back to the question of punk, I mean, I remember when I was a kid, say in the 80s, the idea of a punk rocker was something that was kind of telegraphed through movies or comedies, right? It was kind of like the punk guy. You know what I mean? He was just kind of a comical sort of character who might show up in a sitcom or show up in a movie or something like this. But it was never... did punk music really have much of effect in terms of the American youth is what I'm trying to say. I mean, everybody still listens to the Beatles and the Doors and that kind of stuff. And I do see a lot of people wearing Ramones shirts and things like this. But I mean, to what degree would you say that, quote, punk music has infected the American psyche?
Well, I'd say it's affected the American psyche 98%.
Oh, really?
Well, let's say this. You ever watched a cooking show on the Food Network?
Yeah, probably one or two ever in my life. Yeah.
Okay, so you familiar with how chefs are all sleeved now and they have mohawks?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, you can turn on the cooking channel, and it's like a trend now for like chefs to be like fully sleeved in tattoos and like have mohawks.
I see what you're saying. So maybe not so much the music style, but the image of that. So like cyberpunk and like the Skrillex, shaved head type look.
That just I think punk did more to proliferate the tattoo image than heavy metal.
Oh, wow.
Because I'll give you an example. I think the only sleeved heavy metal guy I ever saw was either Blackie Lawless from Wasp or Nikki Sixx from Motley Crue.
Yeah.
There wasn't really many like fully sleeved heavy metal guys back in the 80s.
That's a good point, yeah.
But punkers are fully sleeved. And that whole thing kind of started a little bit later in like the late 80s and the 90s. Started seeing, guys like Social Distortion and what's that other band? Rancid. Like, everybody in the band has tattoos from the neck down, like just fully covered. And so like that whole thing comes out, and that in and of itself comes from Jailhouse and biker stuff and all that stuff, but it proliferated into the punk scene, and then from the punk scene it proliferated out into the general public.
You
gotta keep them separated. Yeah, exactly.
I think you guys actually touched on the Offspring at one point in the talk, where you were. I think you said that guy actually wasn't really into music.
Oh well, all of the punk bands, they have these. They have a lot of these stories, especially the later ones. That guy, and that singer, that guy Dexter from the Offspring. He is what is he? A bioengineer. He's like a bioengineer and wrote like some thesis on HIV. He has some bizarre. You look it up. It's bizarre. I mean, it's just he's like a doctor.
Right.
Same thing with the guy from Bad Religion. The guy from Bad Religion is he gets interviewed on MSNBC because he's like one of the top atheists. Hangs out with Sam Harris and he like teaches at UCLA. He's a professor. So that's what punk is. Obviously, I mean, when you think of punk, you think of like wealthy academics like hanging out in the halls of power, right?
Well, that's a great segue into where I wanted to go next, because I remember some of the first talks that you guys did that set the series off. You were touching on Henry Rollins, and that's one of the few punk people that I did know a little bit about, and I always thought it was weird. Just because of Henry Rollins kind of having a Hollywood connect and being in films and comedies and so forth, and at the same time being this poet, and then he's also got these like weird economics degrees or whatever his degree was at some strange establishment university. I've already forgotten what it was, but maybe you.
So that was his dad.
Okay, but
his dad was an economics. His dad was an economist.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I got kicked off on this original information was because of Dave McGowan. Mm-hmm. I read Dave McGowan's books. I read his articles like 2008, 2009, right when they came out, and I just got to thinking one day that, like, a couple of years earlier, like around 2006, some friends of mine had been having a conversation, and I was kind of halfway listening to the conversation, but they were discussing a documentary called American Hardcore, and it was a movie about punk. And one of the things that gets mentioned in this movie, maybe even for the first time bringing this to light, is that a lot of the original Washington, D.C. punkers are sons of people in powerful positions. Mm. And so my friends were talking about this, and one of the persons that they mentioned was a guitar player from a band called Marginal Man, and his name is Kenny Inouye, and his dad was Senator Daniel Inouye, the guy who was the head of the Iran-Contra hearings.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And that guy was like a senator for like 50 years. He's basically like
right.
He's like American royalty.
Yeah.
Right. Well, his son was in a DC political punk band. And once you get into the Washington D.C. scene, that's where you start to, and the culmination of kind of moving away from punk and then into this thing called hardcore, which took on a whole new life and meaning of its own. That's where you see the politics start to creep in. It moves away from this, like, lyrics kind of focusing on leisure and rejection, and you see it kind of more taking on political things. And you can span the entire catalog of punk, and I would challenge anyone to find anything conservative, because I've never. It is entirely dominated by liberal philosophy.
Yeah.
Okay.
You look at Rollins, his activism is LGBT stuff, and I had thought about there was something Manson related, and he produced an album of acoustic songs for the famed convict Manson called Completion. Henry Rollins, that is.
Now, you just hit me to something I didn't know. I didn't know he so Rollins put out an album for Manson?
Yes.
Really?
Album's titled Completion. And I was thinking about that because I remember I've had some friends over the years who were off and on Henry Rollins fans, and so they would mention stuff here and there about him, and there always seemed to be this kind of activism in regard to Rollins, where he's always championing some cause, but the causes are incoherent. They're not. They're always like, it's like he's selling something, you know what I mean? But it's not part of a coherent worldview. It's like Manson over here, LGBT over here. It's all over the board, kind of. Then it's going to be World Hunger Relief. It's just all over the board. West Memphis 3, right? Basically, whatever could be a quote liberal cause, right, in a general sense, but it's still not consistent because a lot of these so-called liberal causes are not liberal.
Well, let me just, Nino will give you a larger picture of Henry Rollins, but I'll give you a brief one. He basically went to he attended the Bullis Naval Academy, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, the Bullis Naval Academy is where billionaires' kids go. It's where it's a naval prep school for the Naval Observatory, and it's a very, very prestigious school. Now, this connects with McGowan here because John Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas also attended the Bullis Academy. Okay. And John Phillips is, McGowan points out that Phillips is like the kingpin of, basically the whole
Canyon, right?
Laurel Canyon CIA op there. Well, yeah, that's where Mr. Rollins is. And guess who's the most popular punk of all time? Well, Henry Rollins. And Henry also lives in Benedict Canyon, right next to Laurel Canyon.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, Henry went to the Bullis Academy. He was, he went to, did he go to American University?
That sounds right.
He attended the American University for a little bit. He worked at the National Institute of Health for a little bit. He did some other stuff, but yeah, and then his dad is Paul. Henry's real name is not Rollins. Apparently, you've got so many stories with this guy's life. He's got a whole bunch of stories about a whole bunch of different things. But Rollins is apparently like a character or like some sort of entity that he becomes when he's on stage.
Oh, so he's got the mythology of the Gaga type thing, right? Which or the
yes.
Yeah, the stage persona, like Ziggy Stardust type thing.
Yeah, so Rollins is the name of the being he is when he's on stage, but then his real name in real life is Henry Garfield, but that's not even his real name either. His family's real name is Garfinkel.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Okay.
Well, we all know that Jews changed their name for Hollywood, so yeah. It's well known.
Yeah. So, well, his dad changed the name at some point, I don't know why, but his dad was in the Navy too, and his dad became an economist, but he's not just any economist. He is he's an economist who is hired for, like, he's like a hired witness, like for court cases within government. Okay, but he's also like a public utility economist. It's like it's really high end stuff. Apparently, it's stuff that where like they're looking at resources where like what to invest in, like as far as resources for the future and like how to make profits off of resources.
Yeah, so like mega level shady stuff.
Yeah, his dad is he's a big time dude.
Well, let me ask you this, John. Okay, so let's say like a skeptic. Now, I tend to agree with you, but if somebody's listening, like I have one of my old buddies from high school might be listening, and he's a big fan of some of these bands. He's a big fan of a band I'm going to ask you about here in a minute. But like, let's say somebody was skeptical and they were listening to this and they were saying, "Well, John, look, the only reason these people are getting these gigs is simply because their family is connected." Okay, it's just a reality of the world that some people are connected, and here you are leaping to some conclusion that means that they're like tools of social engineering or icons of social engineering. What would you say to that?
Look at the world you're living in. I mean, can you honestly look back at the 60s and say that wasn't a social engineering project? Like, knowing what you know, I'm saying you, Jay. Let's just say, for instance, you were the skeptic and you were challenging me, right? Mm-hmm. Knowing what you know about social engineering, looking back on the 60s doesn't make it hard to think, man, that was a total social engineering project. Because if it was real opposition, it would have never even got it off the ground.
Yeah, you don't get a lot of big support and money and deals and contracts, at the level of national interest and total exposure, unless you're playing ball with the kinds of plans that they have. So, like, for example, today we see it when people are caving to things like transgender, right? And you hear stories of, oh, so-and-so is not going to be hired anymore because they're not going along with a transgender agenda. I'm just using that as one example because I think that there has been there's been a conscious decision to push transgenderism, and
Oh yeah, and a lot of that came out of punk rock too.
Oh, interesting. So, what's that guy's name?
Yeah.
Who's that guy? The British guy who's like a real weird experimental, and like changes his gender all the time. Kind of a electro pop punk guy. I'm going
electro pop punk guy.
He's into Crowleyanism stuff. A UK guy who's done all kinds of weird quasi porn type music, but pretty popular, pretty well known character. Oh shit!
I know you're stumping me.
Well, you guys mentioned him. He actually came up in the course of the series. I know you mentioned a lot of names, but he's one of these British figures who's still kind of, seen as avant-garde. He's still seen as relevant and popular in that very fringe. Only reason I know about him is because I like the electro stuff, and he's also classed in that at times. But he's a big transgender guy. I forget his name, but anyway, I wanted to ask you about Fugazi. I remember that came up in the discussion. So 2 questions here. You mentioned the DC scene. So how do we get a DC scene out of New York, London, LA? Where does DC come into this? And is there anything interesting about Fugazi?
Yeah, the DC scene stems. DC it would be second wave punk, and second wave punk is this metamorphosis into what I was talking about, hardcore punk. It's faster, it's louder, it's got political elements in it. It has it splinters off into all sorts of different stuff, straight edge and veganism and hardcore crews. My crew's gonna come. Guys singing songs about how this crew's gonna beat up this other crew and stuff, ridiculous stuff. But yeah, all this splinter stuff comes in the second.
I just remembered it. Genesis P. Orridge.
Genesis P. Orridge?
Yeah.
That's the guy?
Well, I believe he's originally a guy. I think he's a woman now, he says.
No, you stumped me. I've never heard of him.
Okay, yeah, he's another one of these interesting guys you would like in your series. So you should look into him. I'm sorry.
Okay,
I'm sorry. Yeah. It just popped in my head. Go ahead.
No, that's cool. That's cool. So the second wave of punk, it kind of, so it comes out of New York and London by way of like a younger generation was caught wind of this punk rock stuff. Kids who were like a little bit younger, and then they started playing punk, and then so by the time the late 70s, early part of the 80s kicks in, that's when you have this DC scene come up.
Okay.
And like I was saying, the New York scene kind of starts in the late 60s, early 70s. The British scene starts in 76 or 77, around there. And then the DC scene comes in about 70, I'd say 78, 79, 80, okay, around there.
Okay.
And so, Fugazi is a little bit later, but Fugazi started by Ian MacKaye. Ian MacKaye, of course, is famous for owning the record label Discord Records, and famous for being the lead singer of the band Minor Threat. Minor Threat, I think they started around 78, 79. But they were popular for the fact that they brought about this term straight edge, which is a whole other splinter scene altogether, having to do with no smoking, no drinking.
That's always weirded me out. Like, where does this come from? The sub genre of like Christian punk?
No, it has nothing to do with Christianity. It actually has to do with atheism. They're atheist, nonconformists who don't believe in drinking or smoking or any of that stuff because that is,
part of this. Oh, that so it's like a tool of control. Okay, I see.
Yeah, you are conforming to society by drinking and smoking and eating meat and doing drugs and all that type of stuff because that is the norm within society. You don't want to conform to that. So it takes this kind of punk ethos and it turns it on its head. This is the product of Ian MacKaye, basically, because the Washington, D.C. scene didn't totally conform to this ethos, but he kind of took it and, ran with it and very popularized it. And so Fugazi takes on this same thing, but they're a little bit later. I think they start around like 1985. And like I said, Ian MacKaye was the singer of that band, guitar player. And he's got an interesting background because his dad worked for the Washington Post. He was a White House correspondent for the Washington Post.
That's what it was, yes. Okay.
Yeah, and his dad was in the JFK motorcade. So yeah, he was there at the JFK motorcade. His dad runs nowadays he runs like some sort of NGO.
4 bars
of some sort.
4 bars and 23 riffs ago. This great nation.
Yeah, so it was what's interesting is as we get along in the series, I'm not kidding. There's like a bunch of people whose parents were like in Dallas.
Huh.
On the fateful day. Yeah, there's like a bunch of punk people who like their parents just happened to be in Dealey Plaza that day. I don't know what that's all about. But Ian MacKaye's dad was one of them. He was in the motorcade. He was like covering it for the Post or something. And Nino's got a whole list of what Ian MacKaye's background, like what his grandparents were into, eugenics, all sorts of bizarre stuff. But just to say that he comes from an establishment family that, I can't remember which one it was. Nino will tell you though, but he has their parents, have to do with the Sidwell School, where all the people in Washington send their kids.
Oh, okay. Been listening to the first half of my interview with independent researcher and musician John Adams of The Afternoon Commute. If you want to hear the full talk, go to JaysAnalysis.com and subscribe for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. And I will give you the email access to all the archives, talks, lectures, interviews, and podcasts over the last couple of years. And also check out my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. There's a tab at the website where you can purchase the book.